and thanks for coming to the last of our Rotman speaker series for the fall. It's a real pleasure to be introducing Eric Schliesser here this afternoon. I met Eric first, it must have been over a decade ago when we were both in grad school. And since then I've known him primarily as a Newton scholar and a historian. And rather than have him speak on a topic about Newton or history, today it's personally satisfying for me that we get to hear him speak on what has really been his a kind of twin main research interests in history and philosophy of economics. So this was the subject of his PhD at University of Chicago, and has been a main focus of his research, looking at different aspects of philosophy of economics, often with a historical twist. And Eric is now a Boff Research Professor at Ghent University, and joined us for the week, so it's been great having him around and getting to talk with him about all of the different things he's interested in. So please join me in welcoming Eric Schliesser.
How far left or right can I wander? Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to the Rotman Center. It's been a terrific week for me. Thank you, Chris. I don't think of myself primarily as a historian and philosopher of economics.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, you can't hear me, huh?
No.
Can we turn up the volume? Because
Yeah.
I don't want to speak up, actually, because my voice is going to give way. That's why I want to... Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I can hear myself now. But I run this blog, and a few years ago I got asked, so this would be a 2-minute unrelated introduction, so I remember to say hi to my mom and dad who are watching, so hi Mom and Dad. A few years ago, Marco Panza, a Newton scholar, wrote me and said, I would like you to come to Paris to examine a dissertation. And I said, great, I haven't been to Paris in a while, I'll be delighted to do it. Sent the dissertation to me. And I get the dissertation, and I had to admit I was a little bit worried it would be all in French. And it was all in French. But it was also only about 20th century financial and mathematical economics. And I didn't think I'd signed up for that. But luckily for me, all the quotes were in English. And the footnotes were basically translations of the quotes. So I could kind of reverse engineer what was between all the, those mathematical equations that I could try to figure out. But then it hit me that in fact, I'd really been working on the history of economics up till 1950, mostly 18th century stuff as a serious hobby. That in fact, there's this great topic to be told, and a story about the mathematization of economics, and also what happened to some concepts. And that's 2 years worth of reflection since that dissertation by Ghislaine Badouk. She got this started, and hopefully her book will come out fairly soon, and you can see what I'm borrowing from her and what I'm adding to it. But that dissertation got this story started. Hold on. No? How do I get it to go back? Both slides are going forward. Yeah, see?
Use the keyboard.
Yeah, both. It only knows one way. There you go. Perfect. Yeah. Good. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce you to my official thesis and also working hypothesis. And it turns out my working hypothesis is false, but that will sort of keep you excited about the story, I hope. It's a working hypothesis about the politics of economics, and that turns out I really was wrong about that. And what I want to, the way I'm going to segue you into the story is give you an account of how the Dutch planning agency explained to the public and to their employers, the Dutch finance ministry, how they could have gotten the 2008-2009 forecast horribly wrong. And it's the only such document in the public domain where a group of econometricians and modelers explain why they think it went wrong. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of study of that, but most of the stuff either gets circulated among central bankers or is embargoed. And there's a lot of outside criticism, of course, but that's not what I'm interested in. And I'm going to try to show you two things with this document. Number one, that what uncertainty really looks like in the real world and when modeling hits the real world. And then I'm going to try to convince you that I'm not going to spend as much time on it as I should, that the modelers themselves actually lack the vocabulary to really talk about this. And what I'm going to then do is I'm going to go back into the history of economics. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on John Maynard Keynes to explain how he thought about uncertainty. Now the reason I do that is partly because Keynes is very well known, and the other guy who really ought to be talked about, Frank Knight, is really unknown, but also to show that my working hypothesis really was false. Because it turns out that both left-wing and right-wing economists prior to World War II were really deeply invested in metaphysical and epistemic uncertainty. After World War II, uncertainty as a concept, and I'm going to explain a little bit more of what I mean by that, gets displaced by two successor concepts. One is randomness, and one is what in talk I'm going to call an arrow commodity or a contingent commodity. And the point of the paper is to make intuitive to you that when this rather philosophic concept got displaced by very rigorous mathematical concepts, something got lost and something got transformed into something which it wasn't before. And moreover, that the two things in which it was transformed in aren't actually identical to each other. That's really what I want to show in an informal manner. There won't be any equations. I will occasionally use modal language because I know there are a lot of philosophers here, but I also will do that very informally. And then if we have time, I'll say something at the end as a wrap-up. Let's see if this works. Okay, so this is my cheat sheet, so occasionally I'll look up as well. Actually, I'll look up quite a bit. So my main thesis, and this I hope to defend, is that post-1950, the mainstream of economics replaced the notion of uncertainty with two successor notions. One is randomness, and one is a contingent commodity. And what I'll try to show is that both successor concepts are not identical to the original concept, and they're not even identical to each other. Now, my working hypothesis, and this turns out to be false, was that what was happening was that you had these right-wing mainstream economics prior to World War II who harped on uncertainty. Think of Hayek, for instance, but also this Frank Knight guy, who I'll say more about in a bit. And then that post-World War II Keynesian economists basically said, no, we can do planning, the world is manageable, we can control our environment, don't listen to these weirdo right-wingers. What will turn out to be the case is that, no, Keynes buys into uncertainty as much as, and even more than Knight. And it turns out that very prominent right-wing economists after World War II actually are at the root of the uncertainty is randomness move. So the working hypothesis that I'm going to unravel turns out to really be false, and we have to replace it with a different understanding of the politics of economics. And I have a story about that, and I think some of that will only come out in Q&A. Now, one assumption I have, and that I'm not going to defend throughout the paper, right, and for some of you this may be the moment to get off the boat, is that there is in fact a coherent distinction between measurable risk, or risk proper, and true uncertainty, which is unmeasurable. That's a coherent distinction, actually intuitive distinction, and that there's nothing wrong with either concept. Right? I'm not going to defend that, in part because the displacement of the distinction, was also not done by argument. So there's really no reason to go over why people bought it and didn't buy it. The displacement was never really argued for one another. What happens after World War II is that true uncertainty just gets dropped from the discipline and moved into the margins of economics. So it doesn't disappear. Somebody like Shackle and the new Keynesians and new institutions, I mean, there's certainly people around that are pushing it, but they're not anymore in the mathematical mainstream broad tent of economics. Now, what's important for the story is that there's both an epistemic and a metaphysical version of uncertainty. When I started this research, I only thought there were epistemic versions. I discovered that Keynes in the probability book actually pushes a metaphysical version. And that was for me the real eye-opener of the story. For philosophers, if you don't like this phrase, metaphysical uncertainty, what I'm really talking about is that the world is not determined. And analytic metaphysicians have gotten all excited about this for their own purposes. For some of you, that means it's a bad idea. I realize that. Now, within economics, and this is due to this guy, I think Malivo invented this, but maybe you guys know better. Well, it's in Knight as well, actually. But the way the distinction gets operationalized is whether or not an insurance market is possible. If an insurance market is possible, you're in a world of measurable risk. If a profitable insurance market is not possible, you're in a world of uncertainty. That's sort of the way to get a grip on the distinction. Again, I'm not going to argue for the sake. It's true that I believe in a distinction. So if in a Q&A you want to say this is a silly, go for it. Okay. 45 minutes, Spain? So I'm going to be spending some time on this self-study report, basically a report by Dutch econometricians who are telling their employers don't give up funding our institute, right? Even though we've just made a colossal set of blunders. That's the context, but it actually turns out to be very illuminating. So between 1971 and 2008, the average error margin in their gross forecast is 0%. Right? All of you are good at math, and you realize it's not as beautiful as that. But just so, they have a terrific track record, and they're also one of the best institutes in the world. I'd like to say it's the house that Tinbergen built. He's the first Nobel laureate in economics, and he's really the guy that brought physical technique into economics in many ways. They are among the state-of-the-art planning agencies all around the world. Okay, let's see if this works. The absolute error margin is larger. Right? In their own mind, you know, whenever they hit next year's forecast within 0.5%, they've done well. So they score themselves. They do reasonably well across the period. The oil shock ruins their really good record. Holland got hit very hard in the oil shock in the early 70s because the oil states refused to send oil to Holland. And anyways. On the other hand, the result is really not so impressive because the Dutch economy, more than 50% of it, give or take, is run on government spending directly or indirectly. And it's actually spending that's direct result of the planning agency's model. Right? So they have a say in, right? So this is good, but it's you know, don't. Now, let's see if this works. I won't go into this, but it's actually fascinating. But the main model is basically 40 structural equations and a lot of thousands of other equations to capture different sectors in this economy. Now, the main reason why this model exists is to facilitate elite bargaining. I'm not going to talk about that, but it's useful to realize that the stuff I'm talking about is really not their main reason for existing. It's really to make sure that the elites are on the same table and don't fight over the numbers. Now this model has one gigantic Achilles heel. Is that English? I mean, you can see it happening during the Lehman crisis. On September 15, 2008, Lehman files for bankruptcy. Luckily for me, the very next day, the modelers put out a prediction for growth of GDP in 2009. And it's, it's small. Dutch economy tends to grow by 2 to 3%. So they know that there's trouble on the horizon. Anybody want to take a quick guess what the real result was the next year?
-4.
What?
-4.
Yeah, you're in the ballpark. Exactly. Curiel wins the prize, right? So the real GDP next year is -4, and they catch that by March. So it takes them 6 months to update their model to get the running year forecast. -4, I mean, this is on tape, so I probably shouldn't say this. I don't think -4 had happened since the Great Depression, and probably not even then. It's for an economy like Holland, where the government does 50% of GDP, is really stunning this. Yeah, this is some numbers from the IMF. The actual world growth was well outside the 90% confidence margin. Right? And in a way, that includes all these countries that are really not trading that much, mostly. So what's going on here? And I think it's just interesting to see what these modelers have to face. They have to somehow take into account the Lehman fall, which in their own universe they treat as a discretionary event. I disagree with that, but it's for today's purpose, it's not really that important. Then what they had to have figured out is to estimate what the impact of that fall is on financial markets. That turned out to be a liquidity crisis, you may remember. But more important, they had to figure out what a liquidity crisis does to trade. Why? Because Holland is, like Canada, a quintessential trading nation. And more than 100% of GDP gets traded in most directions. Turns out that in this liquidity crisis, there was a 20% drop in trade. That had not happened in well over a generation. They've never happened. We'd have to look again to the 30s. Now there's a further problem in their approach, is that the structural equations are always 10 years out of date. So the Dutch economy is moving, and they're trying to keep track with it, but they really don't revise the model like the census, sort of on 10-year cycles. So they always know there's a wiggle factor, they have to account for change, and what they could not see coming is this drop in trade, and that ruins their forecast. Basically, not very complicated. Now here's where the story gets fun. For those of you who read Dutch, you can double check my translation. The example of Lehman describes a fundamental problem in preparing short-term forecasts. There are always risks. The estimate is by definition uncertain. It is important that users of estimates are aware of this and keep it in mind when making policy. Even if the collapse of Lehman Brothers had been accurately predicted, then the consequence of this unique event would probably have been seriously underestimated. Very interesting that they recognize that even if they'd figured that out, they still probably would have gotten it wrong. And then they say, for economics is not an exact science. We philosophers start snickering, what they really mean, it's not an accurate science, etc. But what I'm really interested in is how they're thinking about risk here. Right? Now, I'm going to spare you my Derridarian deconstruction of this report, because they can't actually stabilize this notion in the report. But I just want to tell you what it turns out to be. Risk for these policy economists is this very amorphous concept. It's an event that might happen, but probably not. And it's not clear that they have a way of operationalizing what this notion is in the report. Now, foreseeable risks can be taken into account by the modelers, but it's treated as somehow negligible, and it's also not put in the model. Right? So they sort of have this internal discussions about how should we deal with things that are low likelihood. Let's call it like that. Now, the Dutch, it's sort of very interesting. The Dutch have such a stable universe that they don't even do the kind of things that happen in Israel and Iraq and England, where they actually do what happens under a crisis, what happens under an earthquake. you know, the Dutch modelers basically, life is always good. It's like in Minnesota, you know, you're always above average in Holland. Right? So it's really reminding me how privileged world I live in. No terrorism, no nothing. Anyways, uncertain for these guys seems to mean something like unlikely to be true, and not exact seems to mean something like likely to be an accurate and false. I will come back to them at the very end where I'm going to take a pot shot at them, but I think they deserve that pot shot. But anyways, all I want you to see is modeling can go very, well, you will know, can go very well. Circumstances change. Turns out the model really was not as good as you thought it was, except he's still using it for bargaining. They still go on TV and tell Dutch citizens what next year will look like and who has a better anyways. Okay. The general worry is that everything that did not happen last year or is not in the model is basically treated like risk. That's the problem with this model. Yeah, the rest I've sort of covered. Okay, so I don't generally say nice things about Milton Friedman. A lot of my papers are critical, but I think he was really right about this fact that if you think of modeling as taking a picture of the world, you really are going to have problems thinking really about what's going on in the economy, how to even ask the right questions all the time. I think this is the thing that Milton spent a lifetime arguing about, and I think he's right about this. It's really methodologically in that sense, he deserves some credit. Anyways, I also wanted to put a picture of Milton in. You should probably know who he is, and all the other people I'm going to discuss you probably never heard of. So. Okay, so I'm going to talk really about Keynes, but I should tell you something about Knight. Knight wrote a book, published a book in 1921 called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, and he defends this distinction between risk proper and true uncertainty. That's a large chunk of this book. It was his dissertation. In order to explain where profit of firms comes from. Profit is the reward for taking entrepreneurial risks in environments that are uncertain. That's kind of the model. Now, Knight would be utterly forgotten by now, except that he was the dissertation advisor or co-dissertation advisor, again without tapes, I should be careful, of three very famous economists who all won Nobel Prizes later. He's the godfather of Chicago economics, that's how I describe it. James Buchanan, who ended up in Virginia, George Stigler, who then came back to Chicago, and Milton Friedman. Now Friedman is a little bit gotten out. He was also the undergrad, there was also teacher Paul Samuelson, who's really the genius of economics, as an undergrad teacher. So this guy had an outsized influence on second half 20th century economics, even though he was repudiating that discipline from the 50s onward. He actually was in the philosophy department at Chicago. You know that too? Leonard Linsky tells me anecdotes, well, used to tell me anecdotes about it. Anyways, if you Google uncertainty, Knight is often still used, and people still publish papers in economics with Knightian uncertainty in the title. They don't mean what he means, but it's a façon de parler in the discipline. I'm going to talk about Keynes because he disproves my working hypothesis. Knight, right-winger, small markets, against the state. You know, when the Great Depression hit, these idiots in Chicago were still saying, keep the state small, blah, blah, blah. Keynes, the great genius who developed the welfare state, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Beveridge did, but that's, who cares about the historical fact. So, what's very important for my historical story is that Keynes, in this quote, is defending his general theory of employment, and he's defending epistemic uncertainty in the process. So it's not like there's been a conversion in Keynes that he's, as a kid, used to believe in uncertainty, then the Great Depression hit, and he wrote the general theory. No, no, no. In the exchange of papers in the Quarterly Journal, where all the mainstream economists are saying, Keynes, you're an idiot, your math doesn't add up, blah, 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 he's actually defending epistemic uncertainty. I should probably read this. I don't know if my voice will keep it. By uncertain knowledge, let me explain. I do not mean merely to, you have to imagine a Bloomsbury accent now. This is not the right thing. I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain, what is only probable. The game of roulette is not subject in this sense to uncertainty. Or again, the expectation of life is only slightly uncertain. Even the weather is only moderately uncertain. The sense in which I'm using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention, or the position of private wealth owners in the social system in 1970. Not all of these are on par, obviously, but let's grant them so. About these matters, there's no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know. Nevertheless, the necessity for action and for this decision compels us as practical men to do our best to overlook this awkward fact and to behave exactly as we should if we had behind us, etc., etc., etc. So, Keynes is here describing what I'll call epistemic risk and epistemic uncertainty. There are events that have unknown outcomes but do have an ex-ante probability measure, and these are the sources of probable knowledge. And this is what, in Knight's terminology, is risk proper. Okay? And then there are uncertain events involve cases where there's no scientific basis at all for a probability measure, and the best we could do in such cases is offer ungrounded estimates. And that's Knightian true uncertainty. Epistemically understood. And then there are events that fall between the two extremes, and that's sort of partially uncertain in different degrees. And then, I'm not going to return to that. But then 4, this is important. For practical purposes, when we treat uncertain events as instances of probable knowledge, even though from a theoretical perspective, we have no justification for doing so, I'm going to call that, in my own terminology, ersatz risk. Because it turns out that this move is going to be used against Keynes 20 years later, 15 years later. So that's really a crucial move. You have to make a decision anyway. Now, once intrigued by Keynes' role in this, I actually started to look around and got sent back by the secondary literature to a treatise on probability. But what I found there is, I think, my own reading. I haven't found anybody else who's claimed this. So this passage, I really was blown away by. There appear to be 4 alternatives. Either in some cases there's no probability at all, or probabilities do not at all belong to a single set of magnitude measurable in terms of a common unit, or these measures always exist, but in many cases are and must remain unknown, or probabilities do belong to such a set, and their measures are capable of being determined, although we're not always able to do so, to determine them in practice. And it's the first and the third that really got me thinking that Keynes is here really embracing a metaphysical picture in the first one about uncertainty. Third one, epistemic, but as a contrast to the first one, that's a metaphysical. So I read Keynes here as offering an account of metaphysical indeterminateness or metaphysical uncertainty. Now he nowhere in the book explains why he thinks this first possibility is actually a possibility. And so I'm not a Keynes scholar, somebody can look into this, I just don't know. The third alternative is an epistemic doctrine. I guess I could laser. There you are. But they're clearly facts of the matter that ensure us that really existing probability measures are unavailable to us forever. I'm going to call this, just because I like introducing concepts, I call this soft metaphysical uncertainty. It's an epistemic doctrine, but it's facts of the matter that enforce the epistemic ignorance. And then he doesn't really explain where this comes from, but it's clear, I think, from the rest of his discussion that it involves cognitive limitations. So, you know, maybe if the computer came around, he might think otherwise. I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the historical sense. There's a risk proper and true uncertainty. Risk proper is unknown outcomes, but prior probability measure. True uncertainty means no scientific basis for a probability measure. this is, I really think, the consensus in pre-World War II economics. Keynes fully embraces this. Knight explains profit by it. And even Hayek, who we tend to think as a kind of right-wing ideologue, right, he really emphasizes over and over again that because of this, entrepreneurial profit is in part just a matter of luck. So he doesn't believe in a just rewards theory. And you can understand why he believes that, because he actually buys into the Knightian move that profit always means, doing something that you could not have known would work out well. Right? So this a heroic picture of profit, but also one that basically says, you're just a lucky bastard. Don't take that out of the thing. Okay, so one of the reasons why I'm attracted to this case study is that I think it's a kind of cute instance, I hope, of what in the philosophy of science literature is known as a Kuhn loss. That we have a set of scientific practices built around what I think is a very important and interesting distinction that then gets dropped from the discipline in such a way that people actually don't even know how to talk about these topics in ways that doesn't lead them into contradiction. I think that's like a nice case of Kuhn loss. I also think, why I think it's a loss, is I think the distinction is really a good one to have. And that I haven't argued for, I've just asserted. Okay, so, how am I doing on time? We only have a few economists in the room, so I'm not going to do the, can you recognize this picture again? The one on the bottom is Paul Samuelson, on the left. Most important economist of the 20th century, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to be talking much about it, but he buys into the picture that I'm going to be describing in terms of Arrow and Alkian. Okay, so it matters, as I put this quote from the foundational textbook of mathematical economics, Foundations of Economics. I quote, Samuelson buys into a world of no uncertainty. And he knows what the word means then. It hasn't been forgotten yet. It's 47 or 48. I'm going to talk about Arrow, who, very important and prolific mathematical economist.
The first Nobel Prize.
What?
The first Nobel Prize.
Not the first. No, Tinbergen was the first. But he's early. Samuelson is second, and then I think Arrow's 4 or 3, or very, very early, very important, and also institutionally has his hands in everything. He's like, the guy was over 90, but when they ask somebody put together the 10 most important papers, they ask him, it's like he's involved, his fingers are still involved in everything. Alkian, you probably have never heard of outside of economics, but he ruins my story, my working hypothesis, because Samuelson and Arrow sort of identified as the Keynesian mainstream technocracy. Alkian is a right-wing free marketeer at UCLA who sort of is lumped together with Milton Friedman as kind of on the fringe. He ends up writing a paper I'm going to discuss that founds the area of evolutionary economics. Very influential, like 3,000 words, but he's also a law and economics guy, property rights, that kind of thing. He preferred playing golf to doing economics, and that's why he didn't win the Nobel Prize, probably, because he only published a few influential papers. Okay, so I want to describe a bunch of strategies by which uncertainty got displaced. And I'm going to distinguish, sorry, it's not very clever of me, between a simple displacement strategy and a sophisticated displacement strategy. Somebody may help me with a better terminology. The simple displacement strategy is just to pretend like true uncertainty doesn't exist and just use quantifiable risk. A philosopher is guilty of this strategy. A guy named Tintner, who was a student of Carnap, got the economists thinking like this. I'm not sure if he's the very first. I don't like Foucault, like, now we know who did it. It probably was in the air. Rand Corporation, people are talking to each other. Maybe he got it from Morgenstern and Neumann, But Tintner, I think, is the first one who says, oh, if we talk about uncertainty, let's just do it as quantifiable risk. For those of you interested in the Vienna Circle, Tintner wrote an essay on philosophy of economics in the volume that published Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Remember the encyclopedia? Tindner is that other essay in that volume. We always ignore it, right? It's a boring essay. But he's really responsible for the simple displacement strategy. So we philosophers also have something to account for, I think. I put in the Tobin piece because that's generally taken in the secondary literature as a prominent place where the displacement strategy is already very manifest. The crucial paper, however, is this review article by Ken Arrow, who I think had an appointment in the philosophy department at Harvard, so he's also an honorary philosopher in various ways. This paper is a very long paper. I'm going to discuss it throughout the remainder of the talk, if Spank allows me. It's a review article, and it's basically canvassing all the ways in which people are thinking about probability and uncertainty and going through them, and basically saying none of these ways work except the ones that are primarily mathematical. And that paper gets cited afterwards and creates sort of the standard in which the way economists think about these issues until the math gets much more sophisticated. I'm also going to come back to Arrow because he got me thinking about what really was going on. So the paper starts, this is the abstract. This paper seeks to survey the literature in economics, philosophy, mathematics, and statistics. Aren't we in great company? Because philosophy still matters to economics. On the subject of choice among alternatives, the consequences of which are not certain. Right? I do not wish to face here the question whether or not there's any objective uncertainty in the economic universe. We can disregard metaphysical questions. Right? So metaphysical uncertainty never gets argued against in the rest of the review article. That's just taken off the table right from the start. Now, Arrow does spend a lot of time talking about Knight in the paper. And by the way, for those of you who do a history of political philosophy, Rawls, when he discusses Knight, and he always brings in Arrow. When he discusses Arrow, he nearly always brings in Knight. So these are a generation earlier. They were often seen as kind of polar opposites. It's, some other story I'll tell you, if you ever want me back. Now, Knight's account of epistemic uncertainty is ridiculed because it lacks a formal method. Well, that was the whole point. Right? So, Knight doesn't know math, doesn't do math, no need to deal with it. Now, Arrow's a brilliantly rhetorical writer. He goes on to say, Knight's uncertainties seem to have surprisingly many of the properties of ordinary probabilities. It is not clear, I love how non-philosophers use this terminology too, it is not clear how much is gained by the distinction. That's the argument. Arrow, actually I should say, just for historical merit, Arrow simply ignores the two chapters in the book where Knight, admittedly in language that's not easy to follow, had tried to defend what looks to me like a very self-evident distinction. Unmeasurable, measurable. Nothing metaphysical about. So without engaging with any arguments, Arrow codifies the simple displacement strategy. But now, if this were my whole talk, it wouldn't be an interesting account. Because it turns out there are two other strategies that are far more philosophically subtle and interesting, I think. So the first one, actually everything is related to Arrow this time. The second one is Arrow commodities. In 1952, so a year after the review article, Arrow gave a talk in Paris that actually took a long time to get published in English. So it circulated, and it was used in the building of the general equilibrium model, which is named after Arrow, de Groot, and maybe Ali Khan will listing, Mackenzie, Arrow, de Groot, Mackenzie. I have a friend who really feels strongly about which names belong in that model. He came up with an idea what came to be known as a contingent commodity, or an Arrow de Groot commodity. And even though I also call this a simple displacement strategy, this strategy is actually worth exploring. Now, given that it's all mathematics, and some of you can know how bad I am, I have to look at a textbook that really explains this in normal language. And Starr, who I think was, sorry for the pun, Arrow's star student, he's still alive, wrote this very influential textbook and he has a beautiful account of what an arrow commodity is, and also it makes completely transparent why I think this is just a simple displacement strategy. So let me read. There's also uncertainty. Page 232, right? We're nearly near the end of this textbook, and we're now going to talk about uncertainty. Economically important events that we cannot clearly foresee include the weather, our health, and technical change. Think about that list. It is formally possible fully to take account of uncertainty through a very clever reinterpretation of the model we already have in place. I always love seeing somebody who's a better self-promoter than myself. A very clever strategy. What is it? Uncertainty means that we don't know what's going to happen in the future, right? So it treats it very epistemically. But we do know what might happen. We don't know what we might. Assume that we can make an exhaustive list of all the uncertain events that might take place in the future. Right? We don't know what might happen, but we might make this exhaustive list. At each date, there is assumed to be a finite list of events that describes the condition of the economy in terms of all the economically relevant uncertain events that may occur. A state of the world will be defined by the current condition, in terms of uncertain events, or of the economy and history of past realization of uncertain events that lead into it, to accommodate uncertainty by defining a commodity, I'll explain this in a second more, to include specification of the state of the world. A commodity is now characterized by what it is, by where it is available, and when it's available, and by its state of the world, the uncertain event at which it's deliverable. Think about how this man is teaching economists, graduate students, to think about what uncertainty is. I mean, to give you my own intuitions, start thinking about the modal features of his universe. Somebody of you should become a PhD in modal economics, but it's not me. Okay, so a contingent commodity, presupposes that every possible moment in this model universe has a commodity assigned to it. Now you can devise a contract to deliver just that good and only that good at that moment. By the way, without money, that's really what the beauty of this whole model is. That commodity is known as an arrow security. Now, the next bullet I got based out the Wikipedia entry on this, because I actually haven't found a better way of putting this into words. So the arrow argued that in order to transfer purchasing power across all states in a general equilibrium model, we really only need a single arrow security for each state. Thus, if we have S possible states in any time period and n physically differential economies, we merely necessitate S securities for each time period. So the crucial insight is there are no outcomes of which we cannot create a market in advance. That's really, or insurance market even. That's the crucial notion, right? And in context, this helps salvage the notion of a perfect market. And also, Peter and I were talking about this, you have all these infinite loops that you require to keep this going. Talk about it in Q&A. Now, I think I'm the only one that uses this terminology, modal economics. But I think it's a great meme, and somebody should pick it up and run with it. In this model world, each moment is covered by some contingent commodity that can have an arrow security assigned to it. And it's crucial, really crucial. That's why I have to really make sure I say this right. All possible future moments are really possible, but not necessary, because branches get eliminated along the way. But as you can tell, I hope from the rhetoric, it pretends to eliminate true uncertainty. Right? Because within the model, the conceivable is the possible, and that's this class slightly larger than the actual. But of course, the assumption that we can make such an exhaustive list, a finite list, that's what's at issue here. If we could do that, there wouldn't be real uncertainty. So, my view is that if you get trained into thinking about the world through general equilibrium framework, you never get to ask genuine questions about uncertainty. Just don't know how to think about it. Of course, economists have brains, they get trained in other strategies as well, but for a period, if you are a serious economist, you have to think through general equilibrium. That's not true anymore, but for a long time, for a while, that was the case. Okay, so that's the sophisticated simple displacement strategy. I now want to close by looking at what really turns out to be a very, very, very smart way to get rid of uncertainty. That I really was impressed by. So at the very final closing paragraph, I hope that's true, but I've remembered like that, of the Arrow review, he adds this paragraph. You know, so he's been going through all these viable candidates, and then he says this. Recently, Professor Alkian has argued that the absence of definite criteria for action corresponding to profit maximization in theory of behavior on uncertainty means that we should regard behavior on uncertainty as essentially random. Essentially random. The process of convergence to optimal behavior by trial and error is impossible when the basic conditions are changing and unknown. However, since there will be a process of selection in the economic struggle for existence, I love that this ended up in a review article, this terminology, there will be some tendency towards optimal behavior. This became famous as Friedman's as-if hypothesis. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. Now, the paper that's being referred to is actually one of the most famous papers of the mid-50s by Armin Alkian, Uncertainty, Evolution, Economic Theory. It's a foundational text in evolutionary economics. When I looked this up a few weeks ago, it was cited 3,000 times. And it's also a source for Milton Friedman's famous 1953 methodology paper, and Friedman admits this. This is not unknown. That doesn't mean Friedman got everything from Alkian and vice versa, but non-trivial paper. And I asked around because there actually is a cottage industry of people working on Friedman and Alkian, you know, scholars like you and me. Had you ever noticed Arrow's closing thing? Turns out one guy, Robert McCann, has a footnote in the book. So Robert, if you're listening, you got there first. But what I'm going to do with it is pretty cool too. Now, first of all, it killed my working hypothesis. Alkian is not a standard technocrat. He is in a way, but that's sort of interesting. But he's a right-winger. He's no Keynesian. You know, people like Posner and what's the guy slouching to Gomorrah, the judge that did it, Bork. You know, they love Alkian. You know, really the alternative Republican universe, Alkian is one of their heroes. So he killed my working hypothesis right there and there. Now here's the paper, and it's really the closing paragraph. Again, there's a closing footnote that I want to read to you. The approach suggested here, this is Alkian, is intellectually more modest and realistic. I love when economists use the word realistic, what's going on. Without sacrificing generality. It does not regard uncertainty as an aberrational exogenous disturbance. Right? What it means is we could start modeling this. As does the usual approach from the opposite extreme of accurate foresight. The existence of uncertainty and incomplete information, right? That economics really becomes the study of information in many ways, and over the years, this is like a prophetic paper in so many ways. Is the foundation of the suggested type of analysis. The importance of the concept of a class of chance decisions rests upon it. It permits of various conflicting objectives and motivates and rationalizes a type of adaptive imitative behavior. And it does not destroy the basis of prediction, explanation, or diagnosis. It does not base its aggregate description on individual optimal action. It is capable of incorporating such activity where justified. Right? So forget about micro foundations. We don't need a rational agency at the lowest level. What we need is adaptation and survival of the fittest, really. The formalization of this approach awaits the marriage of the theory of stochastic process and economics, two fields of thought admirably suited for union. This conjecture that the suggested modification is applicable to white. Note 17. Preliminary study in this direction has been very convincing. No references made. It's just been very convincing. No guidance talking to people on RAND at this period, but that's another story. In addition, the suggested approach appears to contain important implications relative to general economic policy. What does that mean? It means this can make economics a very desirable policy science. We can displace the historians, the sociologists, the lawyers, political scientists, all of whom also want to be the favorite policy scientist. We have a means here to do great work. Of course, half the sentence can't prove that, but think about where economics was in 1940, and think of who occupies a different story. So what's going on here? You put uncertainty inside the model, and you identify it as randomness, and it allows you to have determinate, univocal answers to relevant policy questions. I don't want you to think this is the only such move available to economists. There's a whole story to be told about econometrics and about game theory, right? This is not, but this is one such move where you create a mathematical technology that gives you results. Because rather than saying to policymakers, oh, there's uncertainty, we don't know, you're going to say to policymakers, we know there's uncertainty, we've put it inside the model. I want to just close on looking at some philosophic issues here. So, it's an absolutely brilliant way of operationalizing one's ignorance. Because you just understand your ignorance as a sequence of random events. That's the key conceptual move. And if you recall this argument for ersatz risk, it basically takes that not as a consolation prize, but it treats that as the main reason for putting uncertainty inside the model. You have to act anyway. I haven't mentioned Jimmy Savage yet, but he used a very similar argument in the probability book. The statistical, and also a source of, Savage is another line in which this became mainstreamed in economics and philosophy to some degree. Right, so Knightian estimates suitable for ordinary life get replaced by randomness, and it makes what I think is the epistemic versions of Knightian uncertainty tractable. And what Arrow realizes, and again, this really tells you where economics end up going, is you don't need to assume rational agency for this approach. You don't even need to assume consistency for individual agents. Right? So this really is where when the agent-based modelers start taking over, they're really working with this framework without probably crediting it. Okay, I want to just close with some philosophic reflections on this strategy. I have a lot more to say, but I can see Snake is getting impatient. So you have uncertainty within the proposed model world. But metaphysically and practically, there's a huge difference between treating the world as a stochastic process and treating it as indeterminate. And again, the modals will be actually philosophical jargon. That's where the real difference is. Let's see if I can... Yeah. First, the practical and moral issue. If you treat the world as stochastic, that encourages you to think that you can take controlled bets on outcomes. Think about the uses that finance theory is used for. That's bad. If you think, however, that it's indeterminate, it really allows you to constantly remind yourself, I have no clue about underlying distributions. Right? So psychologically, this is already a non-trivial difference. But I think philosophically, there's also something interesting going on. Now, to see this, to make the philosophic point clear and also to be informal but hopefully in control of it, I've started to think about the use of martingales in finance theory. So randomness mathematically comes in many different varieties. But what's crucial for treating in finance theory a process as random is that the numbers are technically unconnected. Markov chains, Kolmogorov, whatever measure you use, the numbers have to be unconnected. But it doesn't mean that in the mathematical structures that you use, all numbers are created equally. All notions of randomness actually make non-trivial bets on possible distributions. Right? So modally, or from a model theory point of view, none of this randomness means that you've actually treated every possible outcome equally probably. And non-trivially in a Markov, all possible moments are necessary. It's very interesting. Okay, so what does this mean? Not all distributions are possible. In this Martingale, mean distributions, yes, median distributions, no. David Levy first pointed this out to me, a very surprising fact. Don't ask me to fully explain it because I'm just going to make a fool of myself. But informally, the crucial result is that not all numbers are created equally. Now, that means that within the model, the conceivable is larger than the possible is larger than the actual. But the constraints on the possible are consequences of the formalism. Right? They're not really all the possible, whatever that is. So as people who work in the foundations of the stuff know, it's all very sensitive to assumptions about possible distributions. And as you all know, we can easily conceive of unfair games. I mean, the world's just not very fair. Should I stop here? Yeah. You know what? I have quite a bit to say about. I have quite a bit to say about another part of the story, namely how contingent commodities and randomness got equated in the revolution in finance theory in the 60s and 70s. And they got equated because at the level of mathematical proof, it's all necessity. And you don't have to explore all the modal implications. But that's for probably a different lecture. So here's what I hope you came away with. It's well known that economics changed dramatically after World War II. But one of the most important changes is that what I'll now call the technocratic mainstream, which means both left-wingers and right-wingers, that they embraced various forms of this displacement strategy to get rid of uncertainty. It doesn't mean that uncertainty disappeared altogether from economics. I also think, as a psychological fact, that when you deny true uncertainty, you will encourage expert overconfidence. I haven't proven that, but I think the closing quote from my friends at the Dutch Planning Agency suggests that there really is a problem. So they closed their own account with the following suggestion: the forecast error from record levels in the macroeconomic outlook can mainly be attributed to an incorrect estimate of the world, not the wrong model. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. That was really interesting, refreshing. So I had a question about one of the very early things that you were talking about, the operationalized definition of risk proper in particular. And you said that insurance is possible for cases that involve risk, but not cases that involve uncertainty. And it seemed to me, though, like, so in the 2008 context in particular, with things like AIG, which was the other big event that was happening at the same time Keynes collapse, was that it seemed as though there was a kind of Knightian uncertainty at play, insofar as, I mean, you define Knightian uncertainty as having no scientific basis at all. I mean, insofar as there was no regulation of over-the-counter CDO trading. We couldn't know anything about the insurance market as it was functioning internal to AIG. And so then, I think for me, just generally, that seems to imply that the whole approach to operationalizing and understanding of risk is not able to speak to, I mean, maybe you could say like the pragmatic effects or the facts on the ground. I don't know what the right way to talk about it would be. But anyway, I was just curious what you thought about the way in which we define operationalized definitions of these kinds of things by the possible creation of an insurance market, which seems related to your modal economics claims, but I don't
Yeah, so there's actually quite a bit packed into your question. Let me formulate it in a way that it sounds like an objection.
Sure.
Okay? So the objection is, you might think that there's an insurance market. People actually have insurance, and then it turns out that in practice, the insurer can't cover. Right? So that's really what happened with AIG. It looked like there was in fact insurance possible for all kinds of products, and then the balance sheet, I think that was $970 billion liability, some gigantic account that only the Federal Reserve balance is like, orders of magnitude larger. Okay, so in making my slides, I did think that this might be a problem, and so I added between parentheses, almost like an economist here, the weasel words. Not that economists are weasels, but just that you want to, in the long run profitable, right? So you might not know. So I'm going a little bit counterfactual on the operationalization. That's really what I'm doing. Is you might think that there's an insurance market possible, but in a way, maybe not. Now, it's also the case that what's interesting about the AIG case is that they really had almost no competition. They were really using, there were a couple, but very little. They were using their excellent balance sheet, the AAA rating, political connections, to really own this market. In a way, if I were to operationalize even more fine-grained, I would say competitive, long-run, profitable insurance market, right? That's a way to think about it. Now, it's also the case that a lot of insurance companies during a bubble don't run the underwriting at a profit. They use that as an easy source of money to make bets on the market. So it's true that it's not clear that this operationalization will always be true at any given moment in time. Right? So any such principle, you have to be very careful. I avoided your question about to what degree regulation plays a role, not because I think it's not important, but for my purposes, regulation is not the issue here. Yeah. Now, it is true that sometimes you bump into true believers and they say, oh, anything can be insured. Just look at Lloyd's, look at governments that are willing to, do terrorism coverage, etc. All I can say is that if there's a group at NYU, mostly free marketers, who are trying to get insurance markets to help us predict future sizes of bailouts, all of their models require that the government co-invests. So I think they're being funded by business, but I think, like all rules of thumb, buyer beware. You don't want to believe in it because people are not like stones. They start figuring out if people start using rules of thumb, they're going to take advantage of it. I think one reason why I personally believe there is metaphysical determinism is that a lot of these objects are intentional objects, and the modalities of intentional objects are really complicated. But I think as a useful way to think about it, this is a good way to go. And the AIGs do blow up. Yeah. Some things shouldn't be covered by insurance. It may take a while to figure that out. But in a way, I think that also proves the point.
Well, can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
So, I guess the worry then for me is if there's no clear account of what the creation of an insurance market means. So it's different things for different people and even different things at different times, then how does the operationalized definition work at all? Because it seems to be very...
Okay, so you're putting your finger on something that does bother me a little bit. And that is, I say, there is unmeasurable risk, right? To call it uncertainty. You just shouldn't think that you can put a number on everything. Yeah. And then you get people saying, yeah, we can put a number. At some moment, it's religion. I mean, you can't really argue and say, well, you're really, I think really these things, at the end of the day, the events turn out one way or turn out another way. On the other hand, what I think is important for my story is not so much my belief in true uncertainty, but that I've shown you what the conceptual tricks are by which that question gets submerged in mathematical technology that then gets sold to gullible graduate students who don't get the warning signs, get used to advanced scientific careers, and get used to make policy, either knowingly or gullibly. We don't want to be, nobody's innocent in these games. And what I think is important is that the conceptual, and for my purposes, not irrelevant, modal assumptions that these technologies, mathematical technologies have, these are not well understood, I think, even by very good practitioners. If you're looking mostly for consistency, you're not looking for modality. That's really what I really learned talking to a lot of very good economists. Many of them teach me what I've said to you.
So, Nick.
Again, thank you for that.
I'm half deaf, so I have to look
Okay,
at
I
it.
will project.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a parenthesis near the end where you reference Taleb,
Yes.
who I read, I think back in 2006 when his book on Black Swan events came out. Right? And the Ludic fallacy, if I recall, was the idea that the unstructured randomness in life will be modelable by the structured randomness of games.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about whether or not you think, because it's what I'm familiar with, to what extent the characteristics of Black Swan events, the idea that they're outlier events with large unpredictable consequences that were, what did he say, retrospectively predictable and rationalizable, speak to the notion of true uncertainty, whether or not these are kind of bedfellow concepts. And secondly, in terms of the modal question, and this is kind of related, there was a very striking quote by Starr, "We know what might happen."
Yeah.
And one of my things I always bang my fist about when I'm trading horses of conceivability questions is that I don't feel I have a really good sense of what the modal space of any question might be in advance. And Stephen Yablo says something like this, like, I'm braced for information that'll make something like zombies inconceivable to me. And so the idea is that it's less, the determinantist question is less important than kind of the epistemic question, that the unknown unknowns are what drive our conception of the ontological questions. So I realize they're kind of two-part.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand the second question,
Yeah.
so I may ask for a follow-up, but
Sure.
but maybe that's because I was already thinking about the first
Right.
question. Here's the map, Taleb. I hardly recommend anybody to read the book, even though he makes fun of us philosophers for a couple of hundred pages. He's very self-important. He thinks all philosophers, with a few exceptions, Contingent, I like, are idiots. He thinks economists are worse. So, and he makes a lot of bold claims that are extremely familiar to us professional philosophers of science. And even so, it's certainly worth reading, if only because you get beautiful pictures of Lebanon of him as a child. Now, he's, by the way, I should say, since the book came out, he's also seen that modality matters, that he hadn't seen that before. And he has I think he's practically begged me to be the referee for one of these papers. He has papers out on modal properties of stochastic technology, let's call it that. So he's evolved, and he's coming closer to the view that I also think is right. I think the main problem with his account is that he really forces people to think about distributions and their tails. And what I want to say is, no, sometimes you really shouldn't be thinking that you understand what the underlying distributions are. And so that's partly a matter of emphasis, because we both agree that tails can be important, that you can be surprised. But he, at he really is pushing for, let's get away from normal distributions and get to different kinds of distributions that are much more like the real world. My own, I'm much more skeptical. I don't think the solution is in improving bets on what the real distribution. He's the 2080s guy, so he thinks a lot of outcomes are really 2080. And I just think that's not the right way to think about this. We really want to be thinking about what is it like to be in a world where you don't have confidence, A, in you knowing the distribution, and B, that there is in fact a determinate distribution to be had. And Taleb really never gets to that last point in my view. He talks often like it, but at the end of the day, he always comes back to these tail events. So that's where he and I, so in a way, I think he ends up emphasizing what I call epistemic uncertainty, and not enough the metaphysical uncertainty. And that's a family debate, and he got there first. So that's why I have a few slides on it. But that's where we are set. Also, he doesn't do the historical stuff that I'm doing. Your second question. Your second question. By the way, I think Nick is one of the greatest bloggers in the universe. It's important. It matters. You should be helping me, Smink. Okay, there we go. Yes, what's the second question?
I'll actually retract it for now.
Oh.
I worry that, I actually worry it might be a bit too confused, and I'll open the floor to other
Me or you?
Me.
There's a question either from Patrick or from online.
It's from one of our online viewers.
Not my mom, I hope.
Well, this one goes by the name Charles, so that's probably unlikely.
Oh, okay.
And Charles asks, is your metaphysical uncertainty equivalent to Lawson's notion of ontological uncertainty?
Whose notion?
Lawson's notion of ontological uncertainty.
Whose notion?
I can Google it if you like, but other than that, I don't know.
Maybe. I don't know. Is this Charles McCann?
Tony Lawson is what he says?
Oh, I haven't thought about Lawson in this context. Lawson is an economist who's really interested in metaphysics and epistemology. Good question. I'm going to look into it.
And yes, it is McCann.
Oh, hi, Charles. I hope you like the plug for your book. He's an economist, though.
So I had going back to the sort of line of Keynes where you have the Ersatz uncertainty, where you say, hey, we're practical men. We can acknowledge that there's true uncertainty in the robust sense that you acknowledge, that you emphasize is lost in the current economics literature.
Could you speak up?
So I'll repeat the question, if I understand.
So what should we do then? So, I mean, current economists, so I think you take Keynes's line to not be displacing uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so I want to get a sense of why Ersatz uncertainty or something that allows you to make action, make decisions in the face of uncertainty while acknowledging that it's true uncertainty is much better than these displacement strategies where you sort of model uncertainty. And I mean, that seems like one of the main losses you see. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a way of dealing with uncertainty before, which now we've sort of pushed under the rug or something. So could you say a little bit more about that contrast?
Yes, so the question is really about this number 4, what I've been calling ersatz risk. And if you remember, Alkian really turns this move on its head and says, rather than treating this as ersatz risk, let's mathematically treat this as randomness. We have to decide anyway. We now have a way. Let's bring in Savage minimaxing or max-min, I guess. It's max-min more, where we're going to maximize downsides by making an extremely negligible assumption, namely that the world is just random. We must make a decision. We now have a rational decision procedure where we just admit we don't know, random, we don't know, let's keep moving, right? And Savage, really, on the airplane and on the train, I've been reading Savage to see if I really should be moving, and that's really also his line. Let's make all of this subjective, and let's pretend like no, there's no objectivity out there, we don't know. And then also, thumb pure hands, we have to make a decision after all. Right? Now notice, I don't actually buy, and maybe this is I'm growing older and maybe conservative in my old age, I don't always see why I have to make a decision, right? So I just want to not get that off the table. It's not philosophically interesting. I just don't want to get that off the table so quickly. But more important, now let me make sure I understand. The question is, why isn't this a good line, or?
Well, so in the so you want to say that earlier economists acknowledge that there was a true uncertainty that shouldn't be treated the way that you think.
Yeah.
So when they said we have to make a decision, so we're going to reason in a certain way, even though there's true uncertainty, you seem to think that there was a way that they had of handling the decision that had to be made that is better than the sort of Savage approach.
Well, better. What's better? I mean, let me remind you, they got us in a Great Depression. So I don't want to.
Well, so is the Kuhn loss actually just the concept of uncertainty?
Yes.
Is lost, or was it that there were aspects of economics that were based on that concept?
Well, okay, yeah. So thank you. Now that's helpful. So what's actually the Kuhn loss that I'm putting my finger on? I think there are a couple of unrelated issues that I've not done a very good job relating in this paper that I'm reflecting on. So, first, the official line I take in the paper is to say that if you think that you're modeling uncertainty in terms of randomness, you are in fact changing the modal perspective you have on the world. Right? So that I stand by until somebody gives me an argument against it. What's lost? That's not so easy to say, but I'll put it like this. Economics, as it developed post-World War II, stopped cultivating a whole set of intellectual practices that Keynes, Knight, and even Hayek shared. These are knowledge of history, knowledge of politics, all the practices that in elitist terms were classified under good judgment. So the exemplaric economist of the world that I'm discovering is a guy named Jacob Viner, who would go from the foremost trade theorist pre-World War II, who would go to Washington, advise politicians, and on the side made great contributions to economics. So one of the things that I think, if you think that the world is really uncertain, you really also have to find some notion of judgment to supplement whatever model you're working with. If you think, however, that the world is a place where you can take mathematical bets, well, there's no judgment. There's just the hard facts. That doesn't mean that you don't hire risk officers and all these people to simulate judgment. So I think that's something that really gets lost. I also think that if you're in a world of uncertainty, that I think expert overconfidence is also much less likely. And I think there's now a good sociology and psychology of science. Our friend Eric Agner has some beautiful papers on this, where people just mistake their own model as a necessary picture of the world. I think if you have uncertainty, true uncertainty, drilled into you from the start, you're not going to confuse the model with reality. It's just, I'm sure it's going to happen, but it's much less likely to happen. So I think that's, in one sense, part of the Kuhn laws.
So you're unhappy with modeling what you call true uncertainty as ersatz risk of putting a probability distribution on it. Which raises the question of how we should model true uncertainty. And there's a number of people who work in decision theory, Jim Joyce prominently, who have been making the move that instead of modeling the agent's credence state by a single probability distribution by some set of probability distributions. And if you do that, then you could say, well, okay, the thing where there's a probability is when everything in that set agrees with on. You model the true uncertainty by having a wide range of things in that set. So, and that suggests that actually a different way of doing this kind of modeling. If you these models, if that's how you're thinking about it, you want to run these models with a wide, not just one probability distribution for the true uncertain things, but a wide range of them, and make your decisions on this sort of ensemble of models. So I guess that's a comment, but the question is, do you think that might be a more adequate way of modeling true uncertainty?
Well, I think there are variants of this approach now in the literature. There's models of models. There's also trying to create integrated decision processes where at each stage you have feedback loops between different kind of experts and the models. Bayesians will have an answer to every problem. So it's certainly, not only Bayesians, I should say, so it's certainly the case that you can add what I will derisively call lots of epicycles to the modeling process. And many of them, I've no doubt, will improve actual decision making in the world. But I also think that there's just the fact of the matter that this is searching for rabbits and hats that try to get around the fact that we sometimes really don't know. And that we're going to not know in ways that are extremely unexpected to us. Now, does that mean we should stop modeling? No, hopefully nobody takes me to say, let's not do models. And also, certainly what I don't want to say is, let's not do theoretical explorations of both extremely esoteric decision modelings and extremely esoteric economic modelings. I actually think all of that needs to happen and needs to be defended against the pure utilitarians about these things. But what I also want to say is that sometimes we have to find decision procedures where we allow ourselves to step back from the model altogether and ask ourselves, is this really the moment where we should be modeling? And as I point out this, so I'll just put this in an anecdote. Last year I happened to be at Santa Barbara on sabbatical. And the same floor as the philosophy department, and if you know anything about housing prices in Santa Barbara, you know that most of the philosophers live very far away from the department. Most on the same sort of philosophy department didn't have a lot of people on site regularly. As it happens, on the same floor as the statistics department, which, as it happens in Santa Barbara, houses their finance people. And there's a guy in there named Jean-Pierre Fouque, who's the world's leading risk specialist. And so I walked by his door one day, I knocked on him, I said, hey, I'm a philosopher, can we talk? And he's French, so he loves talking to philosophers, and we started talking, great time. So his fantasy is that he can get the Federal Reserve to fund what he calls a risk cockpit. We could call it the FOC cockpit, where all the data in the markets come together at the same time, and that on this data in real time we're going to do these kind of modeling. So that we know what we're doing in real time and we're not screwing up our decisions, and we also have all the, we have to have all the universal probability this. So I asked him a very simple question. I said, so how are you going to avoid being fooled by fake data? People in the market know that you're following them. They're going to do all these decoy strategies. Oh, no, we have great computer programs that do data mining, and we can figure out, again, in real time, which positions are really real and which are trying to decoy us. And I said, okay, that's great. How much do you need to get this up and running? And he named a large number. Right? Now, I think that at this moment we've just lost touch of reality. And what I worry about is not that we shouldn't be doing what you're suggesting, but that we also at some moment need to realize that as many epicycles we want to do are not going to get us away from these very inconvenient modal properties of all these approaches. They at somewhere or another want to say, we know the possible distribution space in some way. And the answer is sometimes we really don't know. And we need to also spend money in thinking about other approaches. We can't just keep putting more and more faith in ever more modeling on this. That doesn't mean we should stop. But, so there's a guy at Northwestern, Michigan, his name is Michigan. He's a big fan of multiple portfolios at the same time. And the multiple models that you don't let them integrate with each other, you keep them separate, and they're actually as more competition with each other. And then you extract some meta number out of that. That's an approach. But, one reason why I think it's useful to go back to the history is that there you can still see where the conceptual and philosophical issues are fairly at the surface, and you can talk about it without having to go for reams and reams of proof. But Peter has convinced me this morning that I may have to go through his proofs for this thing, because the rabbits that are being pulled at the hats are generally of a very similar type. And so, maybe you disagree, but I'm not going to, that's my religion right now. I don't think we can model our way out of genuine uncertainty.
I have a quick question. You mentioned Friedman's essay, Methodology of Positive Economics.
Yeah.
And you and I had a talk about it a bit. I'm just wondering, now that I've seen the paper, is there a takeaway that I should get from your presentation as to what you feel the status of that is, and especially the relation between the Bayesian approach and the approach in essays in Methodology of Positive Economics of
I've never thought about contrasting Friedman to the Bayesians. It's just not. Look, I should say first of all, just so people are up to speed, the Friedman 1953 paper has had iconic status in two intellectual worlds. One is as one of the few documents that working economists would get exposed to about the methodology that they're following. And two philosophers of economics, starting with Hausman and others, created an industry using that text and only almost that text to discuss our shared enterprise. That's the thing I teach regularly when I introduce people to philosophy of economics. And one of the surprising things about the methodology of positive economics, Friedman 1953, is that it, to philosophers, instinctively reads as instrumentalism, as promoting as if theorizing. And you can see why. You have to treat agents as if optimizers, and that will generate good predictions. I actually don't think that that's what Friedman himself intended, or what his own practice conforms to that. So I have a lot of strange revisionary views that I've, partly by archival work, have about it. So that is, I want to start there. Friedman, so there are two sides to Friedman. On the one hand, Friedman is the co-author with Savage of the approach that really becomes standard rational choice economics. That in the sense that if you want to understand a decision, what you need is consistency. Minimal consistency of preferences or consistency of outcomes at a given time. I want to claim that that side of Friedman is part of the displacement strategy. That's just as much a displacement strategy as the ones I've talked about. On the other hand, what Friedman, I think, always got right is that if you are going to try to model the universe by capturing it as a picture of it, you're not really understanding what's happening at industry-wide level. So to put this first in jargon and then so philosophy understands, Friedman always believed in a Marshallian demand curve, which required not so much a general equilibrium approach, but an industry-specific approach to supply and demand. And what he thought was needed, and I've documented, is basically a 50-year research program to understanding components of very complicated economies. So now that I've worked my way to an answer, I think Friedman's gut intuition is that we're in a terrible position to create an economy-wide model, period. And that it's going to take many decades of extremely detailed empirical work to get a feel for the evolution of the component parts of an economy and how they interrelate and how they evolve, etc. And I think, and I don't think I have textual evidence for this, I think what he really was driving at is that he thought to think that you could have a Walrasian picture of an economy, that's like fantasy. Now, if he ever connected that to my notion of uncertainty, I don't know, but I have to look into that. So I think he was definitely trained in a regime that thought that no model could capture the complexity of the world. He himself offered shortcuts so that you could do policy. I mean, I put him on the Alkean side of the spectrum. But yeah, I'd have to look more to see if there's more there than that. Wishy-washy answer, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Eric.